So thank you and good evening from my side. My name is Bernard Possett. Together with Nick Shannon, I'm kind of holding together the Center for Applied Dialectics. And I'm very grateful to you, Nick, that you have been organizing this meeting, and over to you, and please make an introduction to this session.
Thank you, Bernard. And this session and hopefully a few more to follow are going to be based on authors' work who have contributed to the Routledge International Handbook of Dialectical Thinking, which I introduced a little while ago, and which is still on schedule to be published just towards the end of July. I'll keep you informed about that. And so it's really with great pleasure that Michael Mascolo, or is it Mascolo? I think it depends on which part of the world you're in, but he'll correct us on that, has agreed to talk about his chapter today for many reasons. But first and foremost, it's applied dialectical thinking, which is what CAD is all about. So it's less theoretical and more about practice. And secondly, because if the world needs anything right now, it's about creating common ground between polarized parties in the political domain. And that's exactly the subject of Mike's chapter today. And thirdly, I just read this morning that students at Oxford University, my alma mater, have started protesting about what's going on between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza. And this conflict, which is truly of horrendous proportions now, just doesn't seem to have an end to it, horribly. And we need desperately in this world to figure out how we can resolve these conflicts peaceably without the huge human suffering. And so if dialectical thinking can offer us anything, then I think Mike Mascolo's work is probably one huge step forward. And so I really commend this session to everybody, and hope that you'll find something interesting and useful in it that you can take forward to your own communities. So thank you very much, Michael, for being here today. And I think I should just hand over the floor to you.
Sure, thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. I will make a very short introduction because Nick just said everything I would have wanted to say. And by way of my introduction, I want to say that I'm just have been delighted to be able to work with Nick and Anastasia on this project on the Dialectical Thinking Handbook. I couldn't have had better, more hardworking, smart colleagues. It's been wonderful, and I appreciate that very much. Yes, the world seems to be imploding in so many different ways. As I was saying to Bernard beforehand, Steven Pinker says that we're living in the best of times. It's hard to disagree with a lot of what he has to say. Poverty is down, hunger is down, disease is down. People are living better than they ever have. Yet we have such conflict. It doesn't feel that way. And it seems as though that things are getting worse than better in so many different ways. So what can we do about that? So dialectical thinking is the antidote to political dogma. Dialectical thinking is the antidote to dogmatism. Shannon Brincap is one of the people who is contributing to the Routledge Handbook. He said this in his chapter, and I just love this. I think this is so important. If there was ever an if only, we say, if only this happened, if only people thought this way, things would be different. That's such a stupid way of thinking, except I'm going to say, if only people thought dialectically. I cannot help but think that we would not be more reflective, that we would be more humble. We would be able to solve our problems much easier because we're not simply going to run roughshod over our opponents. So what Shannon has to say here is so important to me. So dialectical thinking, we know this. We start off with a thesis, and that thesis brings about an antithesis. And then that antithesis splits, undergoes differentiation as it accommodates, as B accommodates to A. We get a splitting. And as A accommodates to B, we get the opposite. We get more splitting. And the final synthesis comes after we destroy, in some sense, A and B, the off-haven of development, and we split those A's and B's, those contradictions, and we put it together into a higher order synthesis. This is dialectical thinking. This is the dialectical process. And our conflict in the world is usually based upon A versus B. A is better than B. B is better than A. I'm going to try to show you who's got the truth. And I think this is our biggest problem. Let's start with a study. So you've got, these are American participants in a study. You've got liberal participants and conservative participants. And they are all read a policy statement, a political policy statement. It's going to be on welfare. And the welfare is a generous welfare policy that's being discussed. So you have liberal participants and conservative participants, and you tell them either that the policy is supported by Democrats, the liberals, or that the policy is supported by conservatives, the Republicans. You ask them, to what extent do you endorse this agreement, this statement? Well, of course, not surprisingly, when the liberals hear that the policy statement is supported by Democrats, they endorse it very highly. Strangely, when the conservatives hear that the generous liberal policy is supported by Republicans, they also support it highly. And quite interesting, this same exact statement, when the liberals hear that it is supported by Republicans, they don't support it. And conversely, when the conservatives hear that the same policy is supported by Democrats, they don't support it. And it turns out it doesn't matter whether or not the policy statement is generous or not. If it's a stringent policy, you get the same exact results. Now, what does this suggest? It suggests that when we identify with a valued ideology, we are for us and against them. So often what we hear is people saying, oh, those people on the other side, they don't listen to reality. They don't see the facts. Well, frankly, the facts don't particularly matter very much once ideology and an emotional investment in ideology, which incidentally we can't avoid, once we are invested in an ideology, we'll see things through that ideology and we construct the other as other rather than us. How can we become for each other rather than just for us versus them? That's point one. Point two. In the West and in the United States, and much of what I'm going to be talking about is coming from the States, we have an adversarial system of politics. We have adversarial politics. There's a whole bunch, as we know, of governments that we can have. We can have an authoritarian government. We can have a hierarchical government, such as in China. We can have a monarchy, and we can have democracies. Of course, democracy is the worst form of government, except, of course, for all the other governments that have been tried from time to time, and you'll recognize that as the famous quote from Winston Churchill. Democracy is slow. Democracy is messy. Democracy has checks and balances. It's hard to get things done. Yet, it seems to be, up until this point at least, the best form of government for making collective decisions, for resolving conflict without resorting to violence. And how does it do it? Well, it does a very clever thing, it seems to me, that democracy replaces war with adversarial politics. War is adversarial, but so is our politics. So is our democratic politics. We debate. We have two people on two different sides of a debate. They are adversaries. They try to prove each other wrong, if you will. They try to win. We have voting, we have elections, we try to win elections. And then when we win elections, we go into Congress or what have you, and we deliberate and we debate and we debate and we try to come up with solutions, and all of which is the outcome of an adversarial process. Now, this has arguably worked for a long period of time, but it relies, and adversarial politics relies on something that is not adversarial. Adversarial politics relies on shared political virtues, an agonistic common ground, if you will. And that common political virtue ground are things like this: a shared vision of the nation, faith in the democratic process, the rule of law, compromise, respect for the other, transition of power, a peaceful transition of power from one administration to another. The problem is that these political, classic, traditional virtues are being deeply strained. And an adversarial democracy, I suggest, splits when the agonistic common ground is no longer there to hold the two parties or the multiple parties together in constructive dialogue, even of an adversarial sort. And so we get what we started to talk about before. We see that there is violence, we see strife, and we're now seeing it, for example, in colleges and universities with young people resisting and protesting against the issues in the war in Gaza and so such things. So, what should we do? One thing we could do is we could try to restore traditional political virtues. We could say, hey, the past we've had traditional political virtues, they're going away. Let's fix this by coming back to an earlier time. Well, let's take a look at that earlier time. Here's the first election in the United States. Who is this? Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, after the United States, after we separated from the UK. What do we have here? We have Jefferson's accolades referring to Adams as that hideous hermaphroditic character. This is not a respectful statement. We have Andrew Jackson and Adams's son, John Quincy Adams. Jackson would refer to Adams as a pimp, and of course, Adams returns the favor by referring to the divorced Jackson as a polygamist. We had in the United States something called the Civil War, which some people might suggest has been fighting and continuing to be fought since that time. And of course, we had the 1960s, where many forms of authority were disrupted, and we had much violence in the streets, we see some reminiscence of that now. So if we try to restore political virtues, one of the things we ought to do is to go back and to see that, yes, those political virtues did in fact work. It seems to me that there was much bipartisanship, but there was also a lot of non-bipartisanship. We don't see the extraordinarily nasty ways in which the democratic process has moved over time. Perhaps the problem is with the very structure of adversarial politics itself. And this is something that I came upon when I was thinking, when I teach people how to engage in conflict management and political conflict management. We start usually by engaging in a debate and showing how the political debate doesn't work to solve problems. And then what happens is I try to teach in alternative ways that I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes based on dialectical thinking. And they work so much better. But it takes a long time to make the transition between the adversarial process and the more constructive dialectical process. Why is that? It occurred to me. It occurs to me that it's because the very way we think about politics, power, is in an adversarial way. When we think politics, we think adversary, we think power struggle, we think battle, we think war, we think winning. And the opposite of that is very different. What if we were able to begin to think of our political processes, not in terms of adversarial structures, but more in terms of collaborative or dialectical processes? Things would look different. And I want to suggest how that might be. So in the adversarial process, what we have here is a zero-sum game. So there's an election. And the election is very much like the American game of football, not like the football, the soccer of the UK. And in what we have here is we've got big men in all dressed up in big men gear with protectives, and the goal is to get that football to the other side. And it's a zero-sum game because every advance I make comes at your expense, and every advance I make comes at your expense, and every advance you make comes at my expense, and every advance you make comes at my expense. And at the end, there's a winner and a loser, and at best you have a tie or a compromise where nobody is particularly happy. That's a zero-sum game. And so without shared political virtues, what we get is different sides doing whatever they need to do to win. We get attacking and defending. We get polarization like we have now. We get solutions, political solutions that favor one party over the other party. What I'm going to be asking in a few seconds is, well, what would it look like if we didn't do that? What would it look like if we did not seek out political solutions that favor one party over another party, but that seek to address the needs of both parties, the apparently conflicting needs of both parties? What would that deliberation process look like? What would the systemic solutions look like? We misrepresent and we dehumanize the other without shared political virtues because we just want to win and get what we want. And we have political gridlock, which is certainly what we have in the United States, and I think across the Western world. Can we do better? Perhaps democracy isn't done evolving. So often we think that there are established systems that we have now, say capitalism, say democracy, that this is it, we did it, it's there, it's done. It's not going to get any better. This is what many conservatives, for example, think when they think of capitalism. You don't have to go to socialism to replace capitalism. You could simply say, can capitalism evolve? Can we do better? And the same I want to suggest is for democracy. Maybe we're not done evolving. Maybe we can have a more evolved democracy, and perhaps it might have something to do with collaboration rather than adversarial democracy. How about politics as a form of conflict resolution? How about politics as a form of dialectical engagement? We know a lot about conflict resolution. We know a lot about development. We know a lot about how the ideas develop and emotions develop through the clash of opposites and how novel new ideas come from the integration of opposites. This ideology is ripe, it seems to me, for understanding how we can and should engage in democratic decision-making. So I want to suggest that as we can think about a collaborative democracy, what might it look like? Well, I want to suggest that there's two basic phases, two basic modes of problem solving that we can engage in when we are engaged in political problem solving, both partisan problem solving and political problem solving between countries, etc. And these two basic phases are characterized by one, trying to meet mutual needs of different parties. Again, we tend to think that I have my position, you have your position, and they're in conflict. What if we were to look at the mutual needs behind those conflicting positions and try to meet the needs of each constituency? What would happen? Second phase is reconciling political ideologies. Political ideologies are opposing each other. Well, you've got A and B. Both can't be true at the same time. Of course, dialectical thinking holds that premise into some dubious status. Well, actually, no. Maybe two things can, in tension, be true at the same time in some form. And if we dismantle them, come up with something better. Let's start with what the first process might look like, meeting mutual needs as a form of political problem solving. Again, this comes straight out of very basic conflict management processes. So, mutually meeting needs through collaborative problem solving. Let's start. What do? You identify the needs that motivate clashing, opposing political positions, and you find ways to meet stakeholder needs, all of them simultaneously, to the best you can. Maximum gain. It looks like this. Now, I know that you people in Europe don't tend to have this problem, but we sure do. We are still debating the death penalty. We put people to death. So we have one person. I want the death penalty. We have another person. Killing is wrong. These are two political positions. They're in conflict. They're in conflict with each other. What do we do about this? We can debate back and forth. And when we debate back and forth, it goes back and forth. And people do not, they dig into their solutions. When was the last time you changed your mind in a political debate? It doesn't happen. So what I'm going to be talking about very soon is a study that I performed with 6 people over a 1.5 year period. We trained those 6 people who were from different political parties. Some were liberals, some were conservatives, some were libertarians, some supported Hillary Clinton, some supported Donald Trump. We trained them in both collaborative problem solving and dialectical engagement, the 2 things I'm going to be talking about, two modes of solving problems. And we discussed a series of issues. We tried to propose ways of solving a series of problems, one of them being the death penalty. And I'll talk about how that happened in a few minutes. So here's one of them, the death penalty. When they started off debating the death penalty, it went nowhere. So what does collaborative problem solving say? It says beneath each political position lies an unmet human need. There is a human need, a human reason why people take the positions that they take, including the people that you and I think are crazy, and including the people that the people we think are crazy think is crazy, namely us. What do? You identify those human needs that exist beneath the political positions. You seek out those needs. Person A seeks out the need of the other, as well as him or herself. Person B seeks out the need of the other, including him or herself. The woman has a need for redemption. She wants to see, I'm suggesting here in this example, that people can change, that we can take care of people and preserve their lives. Whereas, let's say, person 1 wants the death penalty because he sees this is the best way of maintaining human safety. Nobody can commit the act again if they're dead. Take these needs and bring them to the surface, both of them, and get rid of the initial positions. Forget about them. We don't need them. We're about to develop new ones in all likelihood. We take these initial needs. We look at them. We take what was at one point opposed, clashing, conflict, and we are now looking at the underlying needs, which may or may not be in conflict. We identify novel ways, suggestions, brainstorm ways of meeting those needs at the same time. And then we try to create a solution that meets both sets of needs. An unforeseen solution that nobody could think about beforehand because you can't think about it without the other person. That's how you create common ground. Common ground has to be created. It's not simply found. We have this notion, common ground. Find common ground. As if there's ground, you're standing over there and I'm standing over there. We'll find this ground that already exists. Well, it doesn't exist until you make it. You have to actually create the common ground. And to do that, you got to break some eggs. You got to change what you're thinking. Now, that's what collaborative problem solving is about. And I have to say that it requires something. There's a prerequisite to it. And without apology, I say this, without apology, that instead of arguing over positions, where we go back and forth between you and me, what we need, unapologetically, is something akin to empathy. It can't be done without it. We need to reach inside of the other. We need to find a way to put our own anger, indignation, offense aside long enough to see that our interlocutor is a person. And we need to try to understand what are the human needs that motivate that person. If I am a Biden supporter, that means looking into the soul, the soft underbelly of the Trump supporter. That means if I'm a Trump supporter, it means looking into the soft underbelly of the Biden supporter or of the progressive left. It indeed means looking into the soft underbelly of China, of Russia, of Ukraine. It means looking into the soft underbelly of Israel and even Gaza and even Hamas. And I do not apologize for saying that. It means connecting to the human needs of the other while acknowledging that that human other may be engaging in activity and taking positions that you find not only disdainful, but perhaps even horrible. We see that that other person's position comes from some set of human need. And if we can find that need and we can try to acknowledge that need, we know this, that the other person might just reciprocate and have compassion because they feel the compassion from me to you. It involves seeking the good in the other, even the other that we may regard as somehow bad or even evil. We seek the good in that person. There is a man named, he's one of my heroes. His name is Daryl Davis. Davis is a Black soul singer. And what he has done is he has connected with white members of the Ku Klux Klan. They have discussions. They bond over music and other types of things. Then, in looking for the good in the other person, asking them questions, being genuinely curious about why it is that they can hate him if they don't even know him. They come to see, the KKK, that this is simply a human being that's across from them. And they begin to soften and change. And Daryl Davis has Ku Klux Klan robes in his closet of people who have given up those robes. He didn't go out to try to convert them. He went out to try to understand them. This is something that is so hard for us to do, understandably so. So that's what collaborative problem solving requires. It's hard. And collaborative problem solving, in the way that I just talked about it, meeting mutual needs, finding novel ways to meet needs, is good. It brings us very far, I believe, and I can show why that is the case in a few seconds. But it can only bring us so far. And the reason for that is that the human needs that generate political positions and clashing political positions are often ideologically driven, ideologically determined. Collaborative problem solving of the sort that I just talked about, trying to meet mutual needs, works best when you're able to parse off the human needs from the ideological concerns, from the moral concerns themselves. That's possible. It can be done, but it only goes so far. At some point, you're going to rub up against ideology because those ideologies actually create the needs and influence the needs that drive the position. So ideologies not only inform and create needs, they actually influence the very positions that people debate over. What do you do when you get to that point? I suggest that there's something that we need to do to reconcile ideologies. I call it dialectical engagement or ideological engagement, and it looks like this. You find the kernel of truth in each party's ideologies, and you construct novel, partially shared ideologies. So here's two people. They have their ideologies. Those ideologies inform and drive positions. What you do is seek mutual kernels of truth. She's going to ask. Maybe she has to squint a lot. Maybe she has to ignore a lot. Maybe she has to hold her nose. But she can find something in this person's ideology that she can agree with because this person is human. And the same is true the other way. And what you can do is construct partially shared beliefs, not fully shared. They're going to be fragmented, but it's a start. And I say that this needs to be done and can be done regardless of the ideologies. And I believe that. So, yes, I say to you, this is possible. Yes, this is possible. Let me show you how. So here's an example. Capital punishment in the United States. The death penalty. We have the death penalty in many states, and in other states we don't. What do we do about this? It's a big issue. So one of the issues that my group of 6 people were discussing was capital punishment. Again, as I said to you, we started off with a debate, and that debate did not go well. And then we engaged in these 2 spheres of problem solving. The first one, meeting mutual needs through collaborative problem solving. Now, note what happens the moment you shift from political debate over solutions to problem solving. Anybody who knows anything about problem solving knows that the most important step in the problem solving process is the first one, representing the problem. If the problem is, should we have the death penalty or not? It's over. There's no problem to be solved because that's not the problem. The problem is, how do we respond to heinous crime? How do we respond to heinous crime? Now, the second we ask that question, we can ask, well, what are our needs? What are the goals? What are the needs that we're trying to meet? And that's the first thing we asked. What are the needs that we're trying to meet? When someone commits a heinous crime, what are our needs? And the group came up with the following. There's a need for justice, vengeance, maybe, consequences. There's a need to keep the public safe. There's a need for prevention. There's a need to understand the origins of heinous crime. There's a need for fairness in the criminal justice system, that if we're going to try people, it should be fair across race, socioeconomic status, gender, etc. We need to address the pain of the victims of perpetrators who have committed heinous crimes. These are the problems, the needs that need to be addressed. And again, they come from a re-asking of the question. Now, second, you got the needs out there. Now you've got something to talk about. Now you've got something that is not necessarily going to divide the people. Now we come up with possible solutions. How is it possible for us to address all of these needs at the same time? Is it possible? And then you brainstorm. And over weeks, and many weeks of meeting 2 hours once a week, this is what the group came up with. This is what everybody in the group was able to agree upon. Here's some shared solutions that came up. And I won't go into detail, but you'll see immediately that the agreement was massive. How do you keep the public safe? There was full agreement that imprisonment was necessary, life imprisonment perhaps necessary, that rehabilitation was necessary, if possible. There was agreement that there was a need for prevention. There was agreement that part of that prevention has to do with socialization, fostering moral understanding in children. Teaching children restorative justice. Everyone agreed on this. Teach boys and men self-control. Address conceptions of masculinity. Teach people how not to be victims. Note, these are some things that could be potentially disruptive. Could address conceptions of masculinity. I would imagine some people being upset about that. Toxic masculinity, people might be upset about that idea. But once people feel safe enough that their concerns are going to be addressed, a lot of that drops away and people are able to agree upon it. Prevention. Systematic changes in society. We need a national discussion of values, people agreed. Early child education and family intervention. Healthcare and mental health services needed to be improved. Economic development. There was an agreement that we have to understand origins of heinous crime through research and the funding of research. People agreed that there was a need for fairness in the criminal justice system by creating fair procedures, addressing race and socioeconomic status in those procedures, reorganizing police values. Note that that says reorganizing police values, not defund the police. Training police and community skills, having partnerships with communities, treating prisoners as people, eliminating for-profit prisons. There was a need to find ways to address the victims' families' pain through restorative justice, making amends, having the perpetrators show self-transformation, and even finding ways to support grieving and forgiveness in victims. And then the big one, justice, just desserts, consequences. People agreed that prison, restorative justice, and even some form of public shaming was something that they would entertain. Now, that's a system. What you have before you is a system, and it's a lot. That's not nothing. There's an awful lot of things that people can agree upon once they feel safe and once it is that we focus on needs rather than debating solutions. But then this brings us right up against ideology. Despite the fact that this massive agreement is possible, it runs up against ideology. There's still disagreement. There are still people who are going to say, I want capital punishment. I don't want capital punishment. What do we do with that? Well, let's get into the process of ideological engagement. So here's Maureen and Cliff, two people who were in the group. Let's look at their ideologies. Maureen believes the Unitarian Universalist principle of the inherent dignity of all persons. She believes that some people have diminished responsibility and predisposing conditions that make them liable to commit crimes, even heinous crimes. She believes that people are capable of redemption. She believes that capital punishment does not always make victims' families whole. She believes that capital punishment makes us killers. Cliff, done by it. Some people are evil. They are irredeemable, he says. Heinous crime must seek some sort of justice or revenge. There's a need to balance the moral scales. Perpetrators should get their just deserts. People must be held responsible. And victims need justice and protection. Death of the other will bring closure to those people. So what do? Let's start with Cliff's first ideological belief. Some people are evil. They're irredeemable. We ask Maureen, understand Cliff. Let Cliff talk about this. Is there anything in what Cliff has to say that you can agree with? Is there any kernel of truth in there, no matter how much you have to squint? Here's a dialectical process. Here is a dialectical conversation. Here is a conversation where I'm going to mark thesis, antithesis, synthesis as to the best it actually occurs. You'll see the conflicts and the resolutions as they move forward, and they're typically partial. So, Cliff says, some people are evil. They are irredeemable. Maureen says, this may be true, but it's very rare. However, if it's very rare, it conflicts with Maureen's belief in the inherent dignity of all people. Can't be very rare and there be inherent dignity of all people, or maybe even with those people for whom it's very rare, they still have dignity, but there's a conflict here. Cliff says, there are psychopaths who kill without empathy and gives many examples of this. He was a police officer. Perpetrators, there's inherent dignity of all people, but I have to see that I find it hard to find inherent dignity in a psychopath who kills without empathy, she says. So therefore, she comes to a point where she says, okay, there's inherent dignity, but almost all people. Now, this seems like a very small change, but it's a change. But it's not such a small change. This is a religiously held belief, the inherent dignity of all people. Look at the direction of the change here. This surprised me. I didn't expect this at all, that Maureen would move in the direction of embracing the sanctity of life to suggesting that somehow that maybe that might be not all people are worthy of dignity. To be sure, at this point, she's still rather unclear about this. But here's the dialectical process. Let's go to another example. So she moves from her position to inherent dignity of all people to inherent dignity of almost all people. What about this one? Heinous crime. Balance the moral scales. Another dialectical process. Cliff, we must avenge evil. Avenge evil. That we need to get revenge upon those who create evil. Think about it. Think about all of the movies about revenge. The cowboy is out there to get revenge on the person who did this horrible thing. Revenge is the way to go. Maureen doesn't like revenge. Revenge, she says, though, there's a belief I have heard of about revenge. It's not really revenge, she says, that when you seek revenge, what you're really doing is you're finding a way to make the perpetrator experience how it feels. When you give revenge, you're not just trying to punish the person, she's saying, but you're showing the perpetrator how it feels. Cliff isn't having it. No, it's to avenge the evil. It's to balance the moral scales. Maureen begins to suggest, no, I don't like this business about avenging moral scales or revenge. How about the concept of consequences? Can we agree upon the concept of consequences, that at least there needs to be some form of consequences? Cliff agrees. Now, is this a remarkable transformation? It is a transformation. Cliff didn't change his ideas about evil, but he has accepted, both of them have moved closer to each other in being able to address the consequences, the concept of consequences rather than the consequences of revenge. And Cliff actually said at one point, I don't mean revenge. I don't mean vengeance. I mean something else. Something has emerged here. Now, I can go through and I can give you more examples. Perpetrators should get their just deserts. People should be held responsible. Both were able to agree, yes, we need justice, but consequences is a better concept than revenge. I'll give you just one more example. Victims need justice, protection. Death brings closure, says Cliff. Here is the exchange. Ellie, another person in the group, talked about how parole takes a toll on the victim's family, that people who are punished for given capital punishment They don't go to death for a long time. They sometimes get parole. And then when the parole issue comes about, the victim's family has to relive this process all over again. Oh my God, Maureen says, I haven't attended enough to victims' needs. And if I haven't attended to the victim's needs, that contrasts and conflicts with my view of the inherent dignity of all people. Anti-death penalty advocates have not adequately addressed the needs of victims' families. Change has happened within Maureen. And change happens in Cliff as well. I'm not going to go into it. I'll just show you that it exists and that we can look at very interesting developmental changes in Cliffs that come from the dialectical process. This leads to the following. All 6 people in this case were able to agree on the following. All the things I told you about before, keeping the public safe through those strategies, prevention through socialization and social change, understanding the origins of heinous crime, fairness in the criminal justice system, addressing the pains of victims' families, and they were able to construct partially shared beliefs on the ideological aspects itself, the inherent dignity of almost all people. Some people have diminished capacity and disposing conditions, some people. Perpetrators must be held responsible, subject to their capacities for control. There are a need for consequences for heinous crime. Many, but not all perpetrators are capable of redemption. There's a need to address the needs of victims' families, and capital punishment only makes some victims whole and not others. Now, we did not solve the problems of capital punishment, but that's not nothing. That is an enormous, as far as I'm concerned, set of beliefs that people agree upon and set of strategies that people agree upon. We never get to these in an adversarial system. We go and we debate piecemeal solutions without ever looking at the underlying problems. We are debating the solutions while characterizing the others as out of touch, etc. If you're able to make the parties feel safe, address needs over time, you can create solutions. And once people feel safe enough, they're able to engage in dialectical dialogue that can lead to novel shared beliefs. So what do you do with all this? How can you move forward? I am not so naive as to believe that voting and adversarial politics are going to go away anytime soon. They are not. They are here. Are they dysfunctional? I think they are. Can democracy evolve? I think it can. How? Well, there. Think globally, act locally. I believe that if we are able to begin to get people in their everyday lives, in their professional lives, in their political lives, to begin to learn these sorts of strategies and ways of thinking about self and other, the idea of connecting to the humanity of the other, the actual process of separating needs from positions, the process of dialectical thinking, that when I see the opposing thought, I don't immediately think that that has to be wrong, but in fact, I am entered into a dialogue with that thought. And the moment I begin to think that that thought may have some credibility, the moment I treat that thought with that other person as credulous rather than incredible, I become humble. I must be able to, at this point, begin to reflect upon what my thinking is and accommodate it to yours, if possible, and you to me. It's not a giving in. It's a clash of opposites, a breaking down possibly of opposites, and a synthesis and integration of opposites to get to a higher level. I believe this can be done starting locally, not globally. It starts with little kids. It starts by bringing it into teaching people to do this and bringing it into their relationships, into their marriages, into their schools, into their organizations, into their local spats in their organizations, into the communities, into the church, into the local government, and little by little by little by little, as people can see, my hope is that once that you can see that we can resolve conflicts better than we think that we ordinarily can, that it can ripple. And then perhaps prominent people look at it and they say, look, this is possible. We need to promote this. And why prominent people don't do this already is beyond me, because it's based on fear. So much fear is at the root of all of so much fear and humiliation. Fear and humiliation, and the antidote to fear and humiliation is connecting to the humanity of each other. And that's hard. That's what I got. I stop.
Wonderful, Michael. Thank you so much. Before everybody came, we were thinking about how to frame and how to start the conversation after your presentation. And I think one of our ideas was, if you have a question for the participants, rather having a standardized Q&A session with you.
Well, the question that I have for participants, I can't help but thinking that it's really the question that they have about it, which is, what are you, crazy? You must be silly. This is pie in the sky nonsense. How do you get people to put down their defenses? You're naive. Is this naive? Maybe that's the question. Or let's state it differently. In what ways is it possible specifically, if desirable, to put these sorts of strategies into practice on a local level? Or are there times when it's justified to go and bomb the other? Those are some questions that come to my mind.
Thank
And
you,
again, my
Michael.
hope would be that I become one of you and we have a discussion rather than it's to me back
Sure.
and forth, my suggestion.
Thank you, Michael.
How exciting. Yeah, I've been thinking hard about, as I get more out of my head and into the concrete details of things, how is it that you get right to the core of the experience of compassion and empathy and understanding the needs of the other when you're so angry? And that the more concrete, and you've talking about painting on concrete, you have more concrete than that. The more concrete, the better. Development goes from the concrete and the experiential to the abstract, and we always go, at least I do, from the abstract to the concrete. It's got to be the other way.
Great. One of my questions is, how can we, what's the motivation for people to join a conversation at all? So, Michael, you were sharing the example of these people, these 6 people, I think, going into dialogue and probably a person facilitating this dialogue. And this must have been many hours, I assume, at least. And why did they do it at all? Why did they do it? Or also, you shared the example of Daryl Davis, the black person who was having these dialogues with Ku Klux Klan members. So you find on the website that I just shared a book that he wrote about the Ku Klux Klan. And also, why did these people even talk to him? So what's the first motivation? Maybe you can say something about this.
Yes, I can. There are 2 motivations why people participated in the group that I did. One is because all of them had some caring about the problems of polarization. And then there was the less important one, very, very distant in the background, which was that I paid them to do it. So there was that. But the example of Daryl Davis is fascinating. I'm going to get it wrong, but you'll get the gist. So he is the only black man in a country music band, and they're playing in some bar somewhere, white people. And somebody comes over to him and says, you know, I really like your playing. I've never seen a black man or heard a black man play this music before. Okay. They're playing blues. They're playing jazz. And they were playing Jerry Lee Lewis songs. And so he started to bond over, you like Jerry Lee Lewis? He goes, yeah. He goes, and Daryl Davis says to the guy, Jerry Lee Lewis learned this from a black man. You realize, don't? No, this is Jerry Lee Lewis song. No black man could play like this. Excuse me, I know Jerry Lee Lewis. He's a friend of mine, says Daryl Davis. And now this person has now got a conflict. He's got an internal conflict. How can I believe at the same time that blacks are inferior, that the music that I love, that I feel this concrete, visceral connection to, is created by somebody who I see as anathema? And then they begin to bond over the music, and then they begin to have conversations. And again, it's the relationship, stupid. It's the seeing the humanity, in this case, the shared love and movement of music. And the internal conflict, I mean, that's the thing, is that I don't think that we really appreciate if Piaget said this the best in many ways, the role of internal conflict in motivating development. When if I have concept A, and I also have concept B, and we are fragmented inside, and they conflict with each other. The moment somebody draws my attention to that, I'm motivated. How do I do both at the same time? And that's what leads to development, in my view.
Has there been any follow-up with Cliff and Maureen to find out whether they still agree or whether they've reverted to their original positions? As we bring up children through school, they're taught that there's right and wrong, and they're taught that there is a right answer to certain questions. And so their understanding of what's true and what's correct knowledge becomes somewhat fixed. And how do you go about kind of unlocking that? Because it seems to me that your process requires a fair amount of flexibility in people's thought process and willingness to accept that truth may be somewhat less fixed than commonly children are taught.
Nick, Maureen still feels the same way that she does. I haven't talked to Cliff about it. Cliff, the Trump supporting guy, who, when I totaled my car and my insurance company wouldn't pay for the totaling, he found me people who would fix my car for less, for whatever the insurance company would pay. And so I know it's not to answer your question, but look at the wonderful compassion of this person who many people would simply dismiss on the basis of his politics. But that's all I got to say about that.
Excellent. Okay.
I want to answer. I've come to believe in a way of thinking that I call moral relationalism. Moral relationalism. We have this idea that there's right and wrong, and we try to buttress our theory of right and wrong in some ground. That ground is God. That ground is nature. That ground is Kant's mind, universal moral principles. I don't believe that these grounds exist. I believe that the grounds that exists are relationships, are relations. That in every given context, there are multiple goods, multiple constraints that exist between you and I, and that we must decide morally what is good in that context on the basis of all of the constraints. So, Nick, you're eating, and I take the bread out of your mouth, and because I want it, and because I'm hungry and I want it, and then you cry, and then you get angry, and you lash out at me. So now we've got three needs: my hunger, your anger, your hunger, your hurt. All these things together, we need to put together to find the moral rule. That's where it comes from. It's always open-ended and constrained. Now, how you do that, how do you get that moral understanding in kids, etc.? I suggest, do you need a mediator all the time? I say, You need a mediator in the same way you need a mediator to do calculus, in the same way that you need a mediator to tell the time. Those mediators are called cultural agents. They're called parents. They're called teachers. Vygotsky says, okay, you know, any higher order function in the child's development occurs twice on two levels, on the social level, then the individual level. We learn to tell time by taking the cultural process of those words, teaching it over time with the kid. The kid internalizes it. Now the kid can do it himself. We do it the same with calculus and everything. It's got to get built into the culture, and we have to do it in our culture, and then only and then does it get into the kid, then it moves forward. So yeah, the process is hard and monumental, and it just strikes me about the paucity, the pusillanimous nature of our capacity to resolve conflict in our culture. That's what's got to change. They're cultural processes. That's what I think. Thank you for stimulating that thought. Thank you, sir. Would it be appropriate for me, Bernard, to ask to state, you say you're studying socio-emotional intelligence or socio-emotional aspect of conflict. Could you maybe comment upon what it is that you're doing, or what it is that you think is the most important socio-emotional aspect of this process in conflict management? May I ask that at least briefly?
When I first came across Otto's work, I found it interesting how he was making distinctions between cognitive and socio-emotional development. And first, of course, not of course, but first I made the mistake, maybe some others also seem to make, that that I kind of saw them separated, like distinct, but not connected. And so only now, more and more, of course, I see how it's possible to talk about them, and it's good to have a language for talking about them separately and not mixed, but at the same time, always having in mind how they cannot be separate. And I think what I could hear from what you shared, Michael, is that a dialectical approach is very helpful to support people as a mediator, facilitator, but without having socio-emotional grounding in oneself and in one's communication, it's more or less impossible, probably, to execute, if this is the correct word, this dialectic. Maybe you could correct or enlarge.
No, I think that's correct. I think that you can't do it without the social-emotional part of it, the social-emotional relational part of it. You know, sadly, in my opinion, how can I say this? In the States, and maybe it's also in the UK, there's a tremendous movement toward socio-emotional understanding and promoting it in the schools. But it's, in my opinion, wrong-headed. What it does is it prompts the student to reflect upon his or her own plight, if you will. It doesn't get the person to get into the experience of the other and to see that courage is needed in order to connect to the other, because they are often devoid of values. In the United States, people like to teach in a value neutral way. They don't want to go to value. They don't want to say that here's the way in which you should be in relation to other people. We need that. We need to help people develop the type of socio-emotional intelligence that gets them out of themselves and into the other, in a value sensitive way.
And there is one link I haven't shared yet, which is the link to your book, Michael, or one of your books, From Conflict to Collaboration. Maybe you want to say a few sentences. Is what you presented today, would we find it also in this book, or?
Find much of it in the book. We wouldn't find the political stuff in the book, but it's the foundation for the political stuff. The interpersonal is the foundation for the political stuff. There's more, but thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody, for being here, for sharing, and for creating this space together. Goodbye. See you next time.